Hi there, Lindsay here, the Frugal Crafter. Today, by request, I'm going to show you how I painted these watercolor cards, and these are actually from a watercolor coloring book. This is a it's meant for card makers. It's a watercolor coloring book by Altenew, and they're known for their beautiful flower designs. And there are 24 sheets in this coloring book, and some of them have dark lines like this, and others have really faint light gray lines. So you can have each design either way, depending if you want a more bold line or if you want a lighter line. And I'm going to show you different ways to deal with both of these types of pictures. It's very relaxing to paint these, and it's a lot of fun because you don't have to own all those stamps. You don't have to try to stamp on textured paper, which can be tough to do, and so there's no waste. You just kind of open up a page, pull it out, and paint and have fun. So here are some examples that I've already done. We're going to make cards at the end of the video. I'll show you how I made these cards. I just think they're so pretty. This was one of, for instance, this is one of the very faint line ones, and this is one of the bold line ones. I prefer the bold line ones. This was a faint line one, this was a bold line one, and these three were all bold lined ones, and I just think they are so fun and pretty and easy to do. Now what I'm doing is making a pack of cards for my mother. She likes to have ones to mail out throughout the year, so I'm making a bunch of variety greetings. I'm making some thank you, I'm making some like best wishes, happy birthday, that sort of thing, so it's kind of like all occasions. But another thing you can do is leave them blank, and then these are 5x7 cards because these are 5x7 images, so when you trim them down, you can put them on a 5x7 base and leave a little border. And what I do with the scraps when I cut down the cardstock, which is 8.5x11 to 7x10, so I can fold it and make a 5x7 card, I take the leftovers, the little strips, and I just stamp. And since these were craft paper cards, I just stamped birthday wishes and thank you on a bunch of the scraps and die cut them out. And I embossed them in white so they would show up there. But if I was doing white cards, like white card bases, I would just die cut a bunch of these shapes and throw them in. I'll show you right here. I keep them right here in this little baggie with these tiny sentiments. So when I need a quick embellishment or a quick sentiment rather, I just grab one of those strips. I stamp on whatever sentiment I need, sympathy, just because, wonderful friend, happy birthday, whatever. And then I've got a really quick sentiment for a card. So quick tip there, those strips of paper you have left over when you're making your card bases, just use them for your sentiments. Just have them ready to go, so it's one less thing you have to think about. So we're going to begin by choosing our images. So I'm going to show you a bunch of different techniques. I think we're going to do 3 different techniques. So we'll need a light colored one, so we'll choose this one because it's a pretty simple design. We probably won't finish any of them, but we'll get a chance. I'll get a chance to show you a bunch of different techniques. Let's see. Let's do this one. This is really pretty. I did that one in a light one too. And let's see. I'm going to do watercolor. I'm going to do marker and watercolor pencil. So let's do another one, another dark one for watercolor pencil. Let's do this one. Why not? Now I'm using these. These are fun. I've done one crafty Zoom night with some of my crafty friends, and I was able to color 6 during our last craft night. It was a lot of fun. So I thought that's a perfect type of project to do in those situations. So we're going to start off with my favorite watercolor technique to do with these, and this is we're going to start just by getting a background in. And I got my watercolors right here. I got a paper towel, and I've got a jar of water. Now, Altenew did release some paintbrushes with this, but I have to say I'm not a huge fan of them, so I'm just going to use my regular paintbrushes. I'm going to start by wetting the paper. Now, here's a tip. If watch this. We wet the front of the paper, and it's going to start to bubble up on us. See that? It's kind of a pain. It's going to bubble up. Well, if you want to prevent that, wet the back of the paper. And especially if you have, like, it's wintertime and the air's real dry, so your paper's going to dry out really fast because you've got your heating on. This is going to help your paper stay wet enough for you. See, now it's nice and flat. Alright, now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to first think about what colors am I going to paint these flowers. If I'm going to paint them, let's say I'm going to do, let's say I'm going to do pink. So I know I've done a lot of pink. Maybe I should do them blue. Okay, let's say I'm going to do them blue. So now I'm going to take some yellow, and I'm just going to kind of add them in. Now I can do the yellow over any of the leaves because I know when I paint green on top of them, they're going to be fine. I'm going to have to remember I said I were going to do these blue because I'm going to forget. So I think there's some, I don't want to have the yellow on top of the flowers though because I don't want them to be changed there. Now let's see, blue looks really nice next to orange. So I'm going to go with a smaller brush though so I don't get too much. So I'm going to get some orange in there because that's going to make that blue pop. So I'm going to go with this pretty orange here. These are the Alta New Artist watercolors, but any watercolors you have are going to be just fine for this. And I'm just going to go ahead and just throw just little dabs of orange here and there. Now the other benefit of wetting the back of the paper is that your paint will generally stay where you put it because you have that equilibrium between the front and the back. So it will blend a bit, but I can go pretty close to where the flower is going to be and add some of that orange and really not have a big issue of it blending in where the petals are. Especially working with a fine brush like this, I can get right in there. And you know, I don't think the brushes are terrible by Alta New. I just think that, you know, I'm a watercolor painter. I've got better brushes, so I'm just going to use those. And let's see, something else I'm going to do since I know I'm going to do these blue. I think I'll just grab some blue. That's a pretty color. I'll do some flicking. Now this will look different depending if your paper, I'm just going to move that out of the way, whether your paper is dry or wet. Now we don't have to worry about that on the flowers because the flowers are going to be blue. Now I'll show you, like this is, when it dries, this is how the flicking looks when it's dry if you put it on wet. And this is how the flicking looks if it's on dry paper, if your paper's dry when you do your flicking. So it just depends on what sort of effect that you want. Alright, so that is, I would let that dry before I went in and put any more on there, although I could go in with some blue and add a little bit of color, but keep in mind when you do this, your color is not going to be very controlled. It is going to blend a little bit because your paper is wet. So I'm going to go in and add a little bit of yellow to the center of that flower. And maybe I'll take some of this blue too because it's a little bit more soft. Not as much water. I want to have less water because I get so much water on the paper. And I'll just go in and give it a little bit of a wash. I like to get my backgrounds in right off the bat because I think it looks really nice to have things kind of fusing together. Cover up some of the weight of that paper. Now if your brush is drier than the paper, it'll spread less. So you can control a little bit more. So keep that in mind. But I think this will give us a nice ethereal look, and not to mention it's going to be pretty darn quick to paint. If you want to go in and do a little bit to the green leaves, you can. Just be careful of the spreading. So look at that. See how it's not runny? I don't want to have runny paint. So I'm just going to throw in there. That's even a little too wet, honestly. If it flows out of the edges, it's not a big deal because we can go in and add crisper, darker leaves later. This is a very kind of almost yellowy sap green color. And this will dry pretty flat because we had both sides of the paper wet. Now, I think I'll just probably set that on, I can set that on a cutting mat. I'm going to wipe off my table. See how it stays nice and flat? Alright, so that needs to dry, so I'm going to set that, I'm actually just going to set that on the floor right next to my space heater. Okay, try not to roll over it with my chair. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to use watercolor pencils. And any brand of watercolor pencils is going to be fine. Let me just, I think I want kind of an orangey red one here, so I'm going to use this color, this crimson, but it doesn't look super cool pink. So what I do when I'm going to use watercolor pencils is I go in the shadow area, and you could start off by putting a background in first. That's totally fine. But a lot of times if you're using watercolor pencils, you might be trying to maybe keep the mess down, keep the water down, probably using a water brush instead of a bucket of water. Maybe you're on a plane, maybe you're in a car, maybe you're just, you know, watching TV with your family and you want to have like a low mess project. So what you're going to do is just go in and put the pigment where the shadows are. So you're probably thinking, Lindsay, I don't know where the shadows are. How am I supposed to know where the shadows are? Well, see where I'm putting stuff? I'm putting it under. So think of the petals are all stacked up here. I'm putting them where the petals overlap. So the petals on top are casting the shadow, or that's where your more concentrated darker colors are, and then I'm leaving the tips lighter so that I'm going to have dimension. So I'm coloring, but also I'm keeping shadow in mind. Now you could color over the entire thing with a pencil if you wanted to, and then add water, like you would a watercolor. You're just doing like a base color, and then you could go back in and add shading later. But this saves time, and I think it looks really pretty. You almost get that Copic colored look, and it's a heck of a lot easier. I wouldn't recommend using alcohol markers on this paper because it's a thirsty paper. This paper is 50% cotton, it says on the pad, and that's going to drink up your ink. It's going to look way darker than you expect, and it's going to use up your markers fast. So I definitely recommend this water-based markers or other water-based products. I'm going to go in now. Here, when you're in the center, you're like, oh no, Lindsay, what do I do? Nothing is overlapping. Well, really, these little stamens in the center are kind of overlapping, so your color is going to go next to those stamens. Okay, so just keep in mind, you're always putting that color behind the previous petal. Does that make sense? So, hopefully that makes sense. So while I'm at it, I can also go in and add some color to the bud. And I can grab a grain. Now you're probably thinking, is that enough colors, Lindsay? You're just adding one color. You know, you can add more, like I might want a little bit more in the leaves, but you're gonna find that with watercolor, since you can do that gradient just by adding more water, you're not gonna need a bunch of colors. Now a water brush is a great way to go with this. I prefer a real brush and a bucket of water if I have it, but if I'm, you know, sitting outside on the deck and I wanna do some coloring in the summer, I'm going to use a water brush. It's going to be a lot easier. You could also use a clear blending marker that is water-based, made for water-based paints. That works really well. You might have to go a little bit slower because it doesn't have as much moisture in it as your paint would, and you might need to scribble it off on paper frequently just to get it to, to clean, because it can clog up those water-based blending markers a bit. But it works great. I'm going to add a little teal to the shadow areas of my leaves. I think that's going to be real pretty when I go in and add my water. Now, I apologize if I'm talking fast. I had some, I don't know if this makes a difference, but today's Valentine's Day when I'm recording this. I decided to have a little crafty time, and I've had like 3 pieces of really yummy chocolate. So I don't know if I've got like a sugar thing. Of course it was a couple hours ago, so probably not. I don't know. But hey. Alright, so once you have that colored, you are going to want to add some water to it. And this brush might be a little bit soft. I think I'm actually going to grab one of my acrylic brushes, or a brush that I use for gouache, which is an opaque watercolor. You don't want a ton of water in there, and you want to check and make sure you don't have water on the ferrule of your brush, which is the metal part. And this would go, even if you're freehanding, oh, let's add a little yellow to the center. Even if you were going to freehand this is the same way I would color it in. I like having the dark lines for this though, because it's just so much easier to see, and that's my preference. But you could definitely do this on one of the other softer colors if you want to. I'm going to start with this. Why not start with the center here where we've got that yellow. Look how nice and vibrant that is. Then I'm going to just make sure I have water in my brush. I'm going to go over here to my leaves, and I am going to drag that color out a bit. Now you may realize that you want more color as you go, but you can always layer up. You're not stuck. You can let this dry and layer up. Now you don't want to go in and put the pencil on the wet paper unless you really want a dark line. So if I was to go in and say, oh shoot, I want more blue in there, I want more green in there, and I grab my pencil and color it on there, I would end up with really bad streaks, because that pigment would be dissolving when it touched the wet paper, and it would not be a nice effect. It would be, unless you're doing something where you want to have really dark streaks, like maybe your flower has a bunch of veining on it and you want to add that to there, you could take a really sharp watercolor pencil and do that. But generally I find the look is not that pleasing. Now look at the beautiful gradient you have there, so easy, only takes you a few minutes. And do the same thing up here. Oftentimes you'll see undertones in your colors you didn't notice once you add water to them. And your colors become a lot brighter. Now you can use your regular colored pencils too. So if you're thinking, geez, I would really like to use my my wax base or my oil based colored pencils. Yeah, that's fine. You can do that. You can even blend it out with a little Gamsol if you don't want to burnish and you want that really strong color. That actually, colored pencils are great on this type of paper because of the texture. You can layer up a lot and you can get some really nice effects. So it just depends on what you want to do. Colored pencils will take a little bit longer. You really do save a lot of time when you work with the watercolor pencils because they just liquefy a lot easier than regular colored pencils with like Gamsol or blending and burnishing regular pencils. So you're going to go through and you're going to do each petal like this. Now you're going to come across some that don't really have any shadow on it like this and you're like, oh no, I don't have any color on there, what do I do? Well, my brush is kind of dirty because I just liquefied that. So what I'm going to do is just go right over here and color that in. And I can leave the tip of it just real light. Okay, so that was just like a dirty brush coloring right there. Just use the residual ink or the residual paint on my brush to do that. Just keep in mind when you're doing this, you don't want a lot of water. And here's why I want to talk about water brushes, because water brushes are great for this, but water brushes also tend to feed water continuously. So you might not want that. You might want to blot your water brush occasionally on a paper towel. Now I like to just kind of make it so it just kind of fades out to almost nothing at the edges. If you want, you could even test one petal and see if it's too dark or if you like that depth of color before going in and coloring them all. Now if I want to fade it out more, I'm going to rinse off my brush a little bit, just scrape it off on the side of my water jar, maybe dab it on the paper towel, and then I can blend it out. So if you see that you've got way too much color than you want, just rinse your brush, blot your brush, and then you can keep on carrying on. We'll do a couple more like this. I think you're probably getting the hang of it. It doesn't, watercolor, if watercolor pencils done like this where it's not real wet, you can work in the next petal. You don't have to be so concerned with the next petal bleeding like you would if you were, say, doing a typical watercolor where they would just run together. You're not getting the petals really wet enough for that to happen, so I wouldn't worry about that. But if you are worried about it, or you're doing a watercolor technique like this, then you can skip. Like, okay, I just did that one. If that petal's really wet and you do that one, you're worried it's going to bleed, just skip and do over here. And if you get too much pigment in your brush, just rinse your brush off and blot it off. And really, don't worry about it. Just keep on going until you filled up the entire picture. I'll finish this off camera and I will show you when we are done. So the next technique I want to show you is the marker technique using the no line. Look at that. You can hardly see that. Isn't that crazy? It's so light. So what I'm going to use is some fine tip markers. And what did I do with those markers? I'm going to use the Ohuhu ones because I have a good selection of colors and they have a really fine tip. So if you have fine liners, and that will work really well. If you have watercolor brush pens, that will work really well. So I'm going to look at this. Okay, what colors do I want? I think I'll do this one in red. So I'm going to choose the red markers that I want, and I've got a good selection here, so I can really have a good choice of what I want. Oh, let's do this kind of like pinky red, and I'm going to do a couple shades of green. Let's do a light one and a darker one, and maybe even a darker red, because that one looks like it might be. I'm going to look at both of those reds. Let's see how those look. I'll get a little piece of paper over here I can swatch. Ooh, I like that one a lot. Let's see what this one looks like. I might use them both, actually. Those are really pretty, but I definitely like that more coral one. Oh, and we need like a yellow. Let's do like maybe like a yellow ochre color. Okay. So for this technique is going to look more like a freehand painting. So I'll show you this on a couple different petals, and then we're going to have to let it dry. So I'm actually going to set that one aside because I think that's probably too light. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your dual brush marker. This is water-based. And you're going to go in and you're going to color in the shadows, just like we did on that flower with the watercolor pencils, except we're doing it with the marker. Now, anywhere you see like folds in the petals, you see lines, you see like underlapping bits, that's where you're going to put the ink. Now, these are water-based markers, and this is watercolor paper, so it should work pretty well. It should dissolve. Try to keep your brush strokes like going with the direction of the petal, because if it doesn't dilute completely, like pinks and purples and blues are tough to dilute sometimes. So you just want to make sure that if it doesn't completely dissolve, that it's going to look like it's going in the right direction. Okay? So now I'm going to go over here and I'm just going to add this. I'll link everything I use in the video description, but say you have, like, you know how the Tombow pens, they have a thicker end. If you have the Tombow pens and you have other fine liners, you can use what you have. Just you'll want a fine line pen in a similar color to what you're using here for the end. So I just wanted to mention that. And this is kind of something I realized as I was working on one of these the other night. I was just feeling so like they were so blah without those dark lines, but I didn't want to outline it in black. But when I realized I could just use a colored fine liner, it worked great. And I don't have like any colored fine liners on their own. It's a supply I don't typically use, but and I like the Tombow pens, but they have a kind of a more thicker bullet tip. But then I remembered I had these Ohuhus. I'm not really necessarily recommending these anymore. They seem to wear down a lot more than they're fine if you're like coloring the rubber of a stamp, and the fine tip ends seem to hold up all right. But like I do find the brush tips kind of fray on these water-based ones a little easier. So unless you're just using them to color a stamp and then stamp it down, like color on the rubber, which, you know, it doesn't matter if they fray, I think I would pass on these. Sometimes you don't know. You don't know how well something's going to hold up until you've used it for a while, unfortunately. The color selection is beautiful though, and that's why I kept them, because I knew I could use them for techniques like this. So here you might actually not want to wait to go on and liquefy, and if you're finding you're really struggling blending, you might even want to go petal by petal, because your marker is going to have a more difficult time to dilute this than, say, dilute a watercolor pencil, because the inks in because markers have ink rather than pigment, and it just doesn't dissolve quite as well. But boy, isn't that pretty? It's so easy. And this is again another one of those things that you can do when you are you're sitting out on the deck, or you're on a plane, or maybe not on a plane. You probably don't want to bring that many markers, but you're sitting maybe in the living room watching TV with your family. This is definitely something that you can do. And if you don't, if you have plenty of flower stamps, stamp them out. Definitely can do that. If you printed this out on a printer, on your printer ink, like something similar, it would probably run unless you have a laser printer, and unless you have a backfeed printer, you probably can't print on watercolor paper. So if you're going to try that, just kind of keep those things in mind. I've never been able to print on my inkjet printers with watercolor paper, and also the ink would run. But if you used a really faint line, you probably would be all right. Like if you used a really, really, really pale gray line like this. But this is easy. It's all done for you. You gotta love that. I will link to this below. This is not a sponsored video, but I did receive these in the mail. The watercolor postcard things in the mail. I was not required to do anything with them. It was just kind of a fun surprise from the folks at Altenew. They knew that I would enjoy this sort of thing, I guess, and it was fun, I have to say. It was really fun. Really fun to play with. So I'm working pretty quickly because those inks in the markers are going to stain. Now, if you have like the real brush pens, let me just grab a couple actually, you can work on this while it is wet. So let's see, I'm just going to swatch that out. Ooh, that's too dark. because they have real bristles, they're not going to be damaged by going on that. Let's see if I have a similar color. Let's see about that one. I think this one might be close enough. So I can go in here and I could add a little bit more color and detail. It's not exactly the same color, but it will do. It's not going to damage the paper. If I went back in with my marker, the marker will soak up some of the water, and it can, you know, make the marker not work for a while, and it can also tear up the paper, peel the paper a little bit. So you want something gentle, like a real brush pen, or you could even go over it with your watercolor paints. Okay, so it just depends on how much detail you want to put in there, how much time you want to put in there, what supplies you have on hand. I'm not suggesting you have all these supplies and you do all these things. I'm just giving you some different ideas on what you could use. And like I said, if you've got watercolor paper and you've got big floral stamps, especially if they're clear stamps because they stamp a little bit better on watercolor paper, you could stamp out a bunch of these, make your own coloring book. That would be fun. You might want to choose like Bristol, which is a, it's almost like a cardstock. You get it at the art supply store with the art pads. It's like a cardstock that accepts water pretty well. You can actually use alcohol ink on Bristol as well, so it's very versatile. Because it's kind of hard to stamp on a textured watercolor paper like this. But I mean, even like this without the outlining, I think it's still really pretty. And keep in mind the direction of the petals. This is great for putting like the little lines, the little veins, I should say, the veins in there. I think it looks really nice. All right, so we've got some nice, I want to add a little more water to that. That's looking a little bit, I don't know, that one, I don't like the way that looks. Oh, something else you could do though, if you do want to add a little bit more pigment, scribble your marker out on a palette or something, and then you can go in and add some color that way without damaging your marker or damaging your paper. So I'm going to do that as well. I find the Zig pens also liquefy a little bit better than a felt tip pen, but I think it's just because it doesn't scribe the paper at all. But you can just soften anything that you want to there. And then for the leaves, same deal. You can even go in a little bit stronger with your color, especially like I'm going to go in with this darker, this lighter color there, and the darker color here. Now when they touch, when you got like that, those markers touch, when they meet each other, you'll feel like an immediate drag on the paper. That's because you're going over wet paper and the marker just wants to streak when you do that. So it's best to kind of bring them up near each other and then just blend them with a wet brush or water brush. I wouldn't use the blending marker on the paper with these because you're going to end up with more streaking. So you're going to finish up like there and then let this dry, and then I will finish this off camera and I will be back. Okay, we're back. Things have dried, and I'll show you kind of how that one finished up dry, and then this one, we still have more to do on that one. We'll get to that in a moment, but I also wanted to start off with this one that is finally dry, and you can see that the top and bottom flowers and these two groups of leaves have more depth, and I'm going to show you how we did that. And just grab any small watercolor brush or whatever you're comfortable with. I would say like a size 6 or smaller. And then you're going to wet, or start off by the leaves, and you just wet the petal. Make sure you don't go outside of the lines. You just want to give a nice primed surface for the paint to flow on. And then you're going to take a lighter green and just go right over. You can go right over the entire thing, or you can just put it in the highlight area. It's up to you. You might want to just do over the whole thing if you are kind of new to watercolor, because it will just be a little bit easier to blend. And then you're going to grab a darker green, and you're going to add that. If it's right underneath I need a little more water in there. If it's underneath a petal, you're going to add it, that's where you're going to add the shadow because it's something overlapping it. Or if it's kind of out in the open, I would add it to the base of the leaf and kind of to the center of the leaf and just let it blend out. Okay, so your leaf needs to be wet enough that the color will blend. Okay, and that's going to dry a little bit lighter, just like the other leaves did. And then for the flowers, very similar. I would actually recommend taking a light blue and just kind of making a wash of the light blue color. I think it's a little bit easier and it skips a step than having to pre-wet a petal. Alright, so this is pretty watery. And you are going to choose one petal and you are just going to very carefully wet the petal. Make sure you don't go out of the lines because you want to keep those nice crisp edges. Now you have a little bit of color there already from that first coating probably when we did the wet into wet. Then you can keep your brush dirty, just go into the darker blue. I'm using these two blues, but this one's very watery. And then you grab the darker blue. I like to test it out on my palette, make sure I don't have any clumps, and then that's going to go in the darker areas. So if you've got a petal that's overlapping it, it's going to go right next to there. If you've got the base of the petal that's kind of in closer to the center of the flower, that's going to be darker, so you put it there. And also, you can put it, like if you have any turned petals, put it under there. Now you can also just kind of gently ease the colors together if they don't seem to be blending very well, or you can wipe your brush off and you can just kind of drag that dark into the light a little bit. I wouldn't add water to it because then you end up with blooms. Now look how much more definition that has and how much more depth than just that straight wash. So you're going to do every petal like this. But you are going to want to skip around a little bit. You want to make sure you're choosing a petal that's not touching one that's wet. So I'm going to go over to this one next. And feel free to turn your paper so that it's comfortable for you. You want to give this a nice good coating. You don't want it puddly though. If it's too puddly, your paint's not going to blend because it's just gonna blop there and sit there because it's going to be fighting the surface tension of the water. So sometimes you need to go in and lift a little bit of water or pigment out if you have too much. So that's could be a reason why your paint might not be moving. You want it to be, you know, inky, not super wet. And then you're just going to touch that into the areas where you want the shadow, again, towards the center of the flower where it's more packed, under the turned petal area. And then generally your edges are going to be a little bit lighter. I'm going to wipe my brush off on my tissue. And then I'm just going to ease those colors together if I need to. You can probably leave the turned petals just the way they are because you have a little bit of base color on there. But if you didn't, then you could put a really light wash after that's dry. If you want more of a highlight, if you clean your brush and you dry it off really good, you could go in and you could lift a little bit of a highlight out to show like a bend in the petal. Just make sure you don't drop water on there accidentally. And so you're going to do that for every single petal, and then you're going to end up with flowers with a lot more definition, which is a really pretty effect. That's called an open drip technique, where you skip around, you're just kind of dripping in the colors. You could even drip in the colors more wildly and have more of like a psychedelic effect if you want to. That's better if you have larger petals, like say how this one is. It's larger petals you could do that on. But it's more of a modern freeform type of look. So what I'm going to do here now is we are going to use the fine line end, and hopefully this marker is dark enough, and you're basically just going to go in and you are going to trace the lines, those really, really light gray lines. I think this is good. And any lines that were stamped that you want to accentuate a bit. You could even go in and add veining. We kind of did that with a real brush pen, and I kind of regret it because the real brush pen was way too like magenta. It was more of like a hot pink, and I don't like that. It didn't go as well as I thought it would. Once it dried, you could really see that dye wasn't the right color. But this is just for informational purposes, so I think I would just wait and use the color that you colored your shadow in to do your fine lining at the end. So that's what I'm going to do right here. You just go around and outline everything, and I'll show you an example of that when you're done. Same thing with the leaves. You're going to go in and you are going to fine line. Now it's very important that this is dry or you are going to mess up your fine liners. I mean, they should revive back again if you do forget, but definitely make sure it's dry if you can remember, because it's just going to give you a better effect. So one that I did that on was this one right here. And it is a little time consuming because you have to go in and outline all those things. I did go a little bit darker around those petals, but it really made a big difference, and you can see the veinings in there and around those little clusters. Just going in with that darker color, the same color or even a darker shade, really makes a big difference with the overall look of the no line. I think I like a little more definition. If you don't have to. If you prefer it to be more wishy-washy. I think I actually did this with watercolors and then went in and fine lined, and then it was on, I had another one, this one right here, I did the shading and then I went in with that color and fine lined it. So this was watercolor with the fine liners over it on a no-lined coloring page. This was markers with the fine liner over it on a no-line page. So it just depends on the look that you're after. Mix and match your media and get the look you're after. That's basically it in a nutshell. And then say you have one like this and you're like, oh shoot, I wish I put a background in, but I didn't, and now I'm kind of bummed out. That's all right. You can still go in and put a background. The thing to keep in mind when you want to put a background in after the fact is that you want to only wet the area where you want color. So I am going to go in here and with my brush, and I'm very carefully going to paint the area I want to put a little color in. I actually want to paint beyond the area I want a little color in. Okay? Because otherwise you're going to have a hard edge where if the pigment comes and reaches out to where the water stops. Okay, let's say I want a little bit of, this blue's really pretty, so we'll mix these two blues together, that way we don't waste it. Okay, now I left a little gap that's probably about 1/16 of an inch between my wet area and the flower. Can you see that? You see where the water's only going where it's wet, and I left that gap. So I leave that gap because then I can go into my brush and I can trace that edge. If I brought water all the way up to that edge, chances are it's going to go over my line and give me a sloppy edge. So leave a gap and then very gently go in with your brush. And you can even go in with a smaller brush. You don't have to use a brush that's this big. I don't know if I did not put enough water up there. Oh shoot, I left a spot pretty blank, but that's alright. I can bring it up to where I wet it. Not a big deal. And that way you can add a little blush of color. I think that's a pretty color. Now if you didn't get it wet far enough and you're like, oh no, I didn't wet far enough, well, clean your brush off, bring that water out, okay? Blot it so you don't have too much water there, and then you can just kind of gently guide that pigment up to where the wet paper is. But it's a lot easier if you just wet it to begin with. If you decide you want it darker, go right back in, right next to the edge of your design, add more. Do it before the paper starts to dry so you don't end up with blooms or weird edges. You can also have a separate brush that you use just for wetting your paper and do it that way. So I want to do that all the way around, so I'm just going to go ahead and quickly wet. You can do section by section too. Oh, I got a fuzzy from my sweater, I think, there. And I'm using a bigger brush because you can hold more paint and you can work a little more quickly, but if that's uncomfortable to you, or you can even go into the smaller areas with a smaller brush, that's fine. A little bit more of that color. Again, I'm going to add it close to the, now that's too watery. And you'll get the feel for, every watercolor paper is a little different. You know, you get the feel for how you like it. And it's going to be a greeting card, so it's going to turn out just fine. So try not to fret, just try to enjoy it. This should be relaxing. You don't even have to worry about stamping it wrong because it's already on the coloring page, which I think is kind of fun. And once you start your background though, you got to finish it. You don't want to stop and then come back to it later. And if you know you're going to trim it, you can just bring the color right out to the edge and not even worry about it. Another thing you could do with a design like this, because it's got such a nice dark line, is you could cut it out. Now I did not wet that background. Take a little more care than I am. I'm just Trying to be quick so I can show you as many techniques in as little time as possible. Because I bet you're anxious to give these a whirl yourself. Just make sure if you're doing this background technique that whatever you begin with is dry. Otherwise you're going to fuzz what you have on the picture. And there's that. It's just a soft little blush. I think it's really pretty when you trim it out. If you have messy edges, it's not even going to matter. Now another thing you can do, I'm probably not, I really don't like how I have those two shades of pink there, so I'm not going to use this one. So I'm just going to show you this technique too. Another thing you can do is some spattering. I really like this, especially if there's not a lot going on in an image. And you just take your colors, any color you want from your palette, usually colors you've used, and you can just do some spattering. You can get bigger or smaller spatters. You can even spatter water on first, and then spatter color into the water, and then you get a little bit more random shapes and the colors mix, and I think it's a really pretty effect. Maybe I'll do some collaging on this and use this for something after all, but I just wanted to show you that spattering technique. Some people like to tap the brush different ways or tap it against their finger. I usually just kind of point and I tap it with my finger on the back of the brush. Now, I want to show you this because sometimes you're doing this technique and oops, you get this all over your focal point and you're bummed because you really loved your focal point and you didn't want to cover it up. So what you do, while the spatter's still wet, you can immediately blot it off. In most cases, you can get all of it off. So if you're doing the spattering and you get it on an area you don't like, blot it off really quick. So that's why you want to make sure you have a paper towel handy when you're doing these techniques. So we're going to take a break, and I'm going to clean up my mess, and it'll probably be tomorrow by the time I come back to finish recording this, but we will make some cards with our lovely designs. Alright, remember how I wasn't happy with this one? Well, what I did was I just did a wash of like a corally red over the entire thing to unify the colors and outlined it again. And I really liked how the splashes kind of made this break up a little bit and gave it an artsy feeling, but I wasn't that happy with this, and I thought, oh, there's another technique I actually wanted to show you, and that was using gouache. Gouache is an opaque watercolor. You can get it in tubes or in jelly cup styles like this, and it's really handy on your card making projects. It dries really quickly, it's great on paper, and it can really kind of save the day on some of your projects. So I'm going to start off just with some white and see how that looks. So I've just got a little dish from the Dollar Tree. I love these little trinket dishes for this. And I'm going to try adding a thinned down bit of white to the highlight areas. And the reason I want it thinned down is I want it to allow some of the color underneath to show through and maybe even blend up through. Now it's going to look more opaque when I first put it down, but as it dries and the ink from that's already there starts to kind of work in and seep up through the gouache layer, it should just like look very natural. So that's what I'm going for here. I'm trying not to hit the lines because I want the lines to show and to give me a little bit of definition, the lines that I fine lined. Of course, you can go over them if you want it to look a little bit more painterly. It's totally up to you and the aesthetic that you like in your work. Now, can you see how that's already starting to like get a little bit more of that pink color in it? You could also use white watercolor. So if your watercolor set has a white pan, you could totally use that. It might not be quite as bold. It won't get as opaque. So if you did want a really bright white area, it's not going to get that bright, but it will definitely help you lighten stuff up if you want to do that. You can give a little bit more depth to certain areas. I like to do it like this just because like here I'm really going to water it down so I can try to blend it in with what I have underneath. It's just going to look really more opaque at first, especially if you've added water to it, but as it dries it's going to be a little bit more blended in. But like any of these petals that are overlapping, I want the highlight on those petals. It's going to help bring them forward. So see how that just is starting to give it a little bit more depth? And because it's a watercolor, you can like lift it off. If you get too much, you can go in with a damp brush and you can lift some of it up and then have, have a little bit more control, soften it up a bit if you want. I like that. I like having that ability. If you did this with acrylics, kind of, once it was dry, it would be permanent. So I'm just blending this with a little bit of water on my brush. And I am putting the strokes down with the direction of like the veining You can also do different colors too. If you wanted a little more pink or a little bit of coral or a little yellow or something in there, you can use that gouache full strength and get a little color that way. So don't be shy. It's a lot of fun, and I just really feel like this has a lot more dimension than it did before. So if I want to do something to the center, I could take some yellow, and I could dab some of that in there. Could add some white to it. And I find that the little firmer brush is a little bit better for the gouache than than a softer watercolor brush, just in case you're wondering. I'm going to grab a little bit of green. I'm going to clean my brush though so I don't get it in there. I like this kind of muted green. Add a little bit of yellow maybe. Dab some of that in there too. You could even do the center black. It really is up to you. Black will give it more of a look like a poppy, and yellow gives it more like a wild rose look. So it's completely up to you how you want to finish it off. And then it's going to dry really quick. So I'm just going to set that aside for a few minutes and it will dry. If your gouache is set up like this, it comes with a lid, and I would recommend sealing it down. If this dries out, you can just add water to it and revive it just like you would watercolor. But I try to just keep the lid on it so it stays moist. If it's drying out on you, you could spritz it with a little bit of distilled water to keep it from cracking. But you know, if it dries, it's still going to work after. You just have to kind of dig at it with your brush a bit. So that's another reason I like the firmer brushes for those. So now let's make some cards with all of our good stuff that we've made. So you know what, maybe we'll use these two because these are the two that we actually colored. So here you can see I finished up the flowers there, and there's what the background looks like dry. It's a very soft look. I think it's really pretty. And there's a couple different options you have for trimming these down, because this is a 5x7 card base, which is a standard size, and if I put this on there it's going to fit it exactly, but I like to have a little bit of a frame or a border. So what I'm going to do is use my paper trimmer to trim it down a little bit. And I'm going to eyeball about, I like to have a eighth to a quarter of an inch reveal. So I'm just going to use my paper trimmer here and trim a little bit off every side. That's just going to give us a pretty effect. And you might, if like you realize that there's something, like maybe you added some splashes and you really like it more on one side than the other, you could trim more off one side than the other. They are pretty well centered, the images. Of course, if you stamped your own and you're watercoloring your own image, if you had it like a little off center, this is where you can fix that, which is really nice. There we go. Now for this one, I've got a lot of space around, so I think I'll use my decal cutter. And this is one I've had forever. You could also use decal scissors, but this is a Creative Memories one. You may have it. The fun thing about this is that it has this little, you can use a straight blade or you can use a decal blade. There may even have been others that I never had, but I don't know, it's just kind of fun. It's fun to bring out the old stuff we haven't used in a while, I think. So this you use with just a little mat underneath. And I'm going to line it up on the grid, and again, I want to take off about a quarter of an inch from each side. I just want to try to make it straight. And this works a little bit better than your scissors just because you can go in a nice straight line. You do have to press pretty firmly though, so I just want to, make sure you realize that. And you do want to have your mat, you do want to have the legs of your trimmer over the edge of your mat so that you get good contact the whole way through. Now I know there's I think Tim Holtz put out a guillotine style paper trimmer that does the decal edges. So if you have that would also work really well. I don't have that because I have this, and I also have decorative edge scissors, and I didn't think I would, it kind of takes up a lot of space, and I didn't think I would use that edge that often. This is just fine. These rotary cutters don't really get dull, I find. I've had this for decades. I think I got it when my son was born, and he's 18 now, so it's been a while. That's when I started scrapbooking. All right. I actually might have got it before then because I had bought some scrapbooking supplies to do some to frame some of my artwork, make some greeting cards and stuff out of my artwork to sell at craft fairs or art shows before I had children. So, and I remember the Creative Memories ones were some of the first things that I got. So press real firm if you do these. Shoot, did that cut through? That's the only thing you have to watch for. If you don't press, I'm going to scoot it down a little bit. If you don't press firmly enough and you have to go over it, chances are your decals aren't going to line up. So you'll need to cut it again. There we go. That's kind of pretty. That's got a really nice space for a sentiment there too. I might actually use one of those craft sentiments that we made out of the leftovers. I think that would actually be really pretty there. Like if I did happy birthday, birthday wishes, or thank you. I think that, oh, that would be really pretty right there, wouldn't it? I like that. Okay, so this one will do with a sentiment like that. I don't think I'll add ribbon to this because I think it looks really pretty. Or maybe I could do ribbon down the edge and tie a bow right here or something. Let's try that. See how that looks. Well, that's kind of pretty too. Yeah, we can do that. That would be pretty. I don't think I'll use a curling tag on this one, but I will on the other one just to show you how it works. And also I want to show you an example without it because that is kind of a... I'm not going to do a bow, I'm just going to do a knot. It is kind of an out-of-date product. I don't think you can find them anymore, so I'm just trying to use them. I know a lot of us have those older, out-of-date products, and I want to give you guys ideas to use them so they don't just sit in a drawer and collect dust. Because I know it's hard to get rid of those things. You know, you've paid money for them, you had such grand plans, and then it's just kind of a bummer when you don't use them, you know. I like this thick organza ribbon because it gives you some volume, but it's also very transparent, so you don't have to, you know, it doesn't cover up your beautiful coloring. I love those kind of dainty touches like that. Okay, I'm going to add adhesive to the back. When I've done a watercolor card, I go generous with the adhesive because, you know how it can kind of cockle a bit? Especially if you didn't wet the back side of the paper. I want to make sure that that it's going to have plenty of points of contact to stick down. You could even add some wet glue if you want, in between your strips of dry glue if you feel like you need that extra strength. Because then the dry glue will kind of clamp it in place while it holds it down. I just think that's such a lovely, it's such a lovely card. That could be done, you could even use this as any occasion, from birthday to sympathy to anything. I just think it's so pretty. Oh my gosh, I just really like that. It's simple, but you know, when you take the time to put it into the coloring, it really does, you know, it really means you don't need to do much for the rest of the card. I hope those watercolor techniques are helpful. You definitely don't need to have special watercolors. If you have a set of Crayola watercolors, you can do all these techniques. You might just want a little bit of white paint in addition if you need to add some highlights, or even you can even use your white gel pen and use a wet brush and spread that ink out. So, you know, I want you to try this with what you have at home already. Now, I might need to add a little bit of glue on, and I think I will, just to make sure it's going to stick under the ribbon. Let's see. I think I'm going to add some glue to this middle part right there. Okay, so I've got the two ends. It should clamp it in place. And then that middle bit will just give it a little extra adhesion through the ribbon. And then I want to add a couple sequins, I think. So let's see. I've got a big gob of adhesive. I don't want to even attempt to control that. So let's do there. This ribbon glue, I got it on clearance, I think at Joann's last year. It works really well. Let's do one right. Man, the glue comes out too fast though. It's ribbon glue, so it's kind of thick, so it works really good for sequins. But it kind of comes out too fast. I should have probably waited and done all my sequins at once. It is a little bit stringy like hot glue, but I do find I can get those little strings off. And this is a diamond painting thing my niece gave me because she does those diamond painting things. Those diamond painting, what do you call them? They're not like cross, they're kind of like cross stitch. I guess it's like similar to cross stitch or paint by numbers. And just a little bit of sparkle there. Could do a couple more. I'll wait and see. But I think that's just a really pretty card, very easy to do. So the next one we're going to do, let's do it so that we can have one of the curling tags on there. And I pulled out a few that were like sentiments, and I've got some that go sideways, and I think that would be really nice to use a sideways one. I think I had a birthday one that went sideways. There's a hello that goes sideways. Get well. Happy birthday. That would be kind of cute. Let me see what other colors I have. So these, I got a bunch of these. When I got that tag curling tool, it was a present. Oh, there's a hello. That hello is pretty. I like that yellow hello. Maybe I'll use the hello because it just looks a lot better with that. It was a present. Oh, you know, it goes this way. So let's see if I do that. Yeah, I think I can still do that. It was a gift, and I generally kind of shy away from products that I think are going to be discontinued and not have like support. Like you won't be able to find the stuff later on. But for this, I actually got this as a gift, so I actually saw a bunch of these on clearance, or the tags on clearance at Big Lots, so I bought those a while back. So I'm just debating whether or not I want a knot and a tag. I think I do want the knot. So I am going to tie this. You always want to put your ribbon on before you adhere it, because otherwise you'll have to go over the inside. You'll have to go through the inside of the card if you wait until after. I like the knot to be near where I'm going to have the tag. I just feel like it adds a nice little bit of volume there. Okay, so the tag, what did I do with that? It's right here, hello. So it's got to go this way. This is the way it's got to be for it to be right side up. So you use one of these tools for this. So if you happen to have one, great time to use it. If you don't have one, you know, find some other way to put a sentiment on there, because this is just this is a very specific weird tool that came out probably about, I don't know, 15 years ago or more. So you basically, you put the tag in the tool so that you've got the saying part against this part that moves, and there's a little divot in there that holds the end of the tag, and there's teeth in there to grab your ribbon. So you just slide that right in there. You might find one of these on a yard sale or on eBay or something, and now you'll know how to use it. So this is what it looks like from the side. You've got to make sure that your sentiment, like see how my sentiment says, can you see how it says hello? So I got to make sure that I'm having that in the right way, so when I put it on my card, it's going to be right side up. And then you're just going to put your ribbon in there. You're going to slide it right. I like to put my ribbon on my card first to make sure I've got it the right way. You can do it without putting it on your card first. And then I'm just going to squeeze, and it's going to crimp that, or actually curl that long metal piece around the ribbon. Okay, I'm just going to pull it out, and there we go. It's kind of cute, I think. I mean, it's kind of pretty. Now, I don't know, I think card making was just kind of starting to get popular because people were scrapbooking, then they had all these scraps, and they started to make cards with the scraps. And then I think at some point card making took over scrapbooking, I think probably because the projects were smaller and felt a little bit more doable to people. So, so kind of that's how, I think that's kind of how that evolved. I think that's really sweet looking. And a hello card, you can always send somebody a hello, right? Again, I want to get my adhesive on the paper next to the ribbon, but I am going to go the other way too and make sure that I've got all these sides well stuck down. I think that's really pretty. Just make sure your card's going to open it the right way, and then you can just press it into place. And I'll probably put some sequins on here too, because I love the way the sequins look. I think that's just a pretty look. So I do have a couple other cards, a couple other pieces to turn into cards, so I will probably do that off screen and put sequins on and everything, and then I'll come back and show you them all together. All right, let's take a look at the finished cards. Now this one I didn't put ribbon on because I feel like there was so much going on with this watercolor that that a ribbon would distract from it. So keep that in mind. And then on the inside of each of these cards, I took a piece of cardstock. I just cut the regular cardstock into quarters, and I used some washi tape to put that in. That gives you a nice bright area to write on if you're using colored cardstock like I am. And it also is easy to remove if you want to reuse the card. So I love to do that. So I did that on the inside of each card. And we're just going to flip through the finished ones to give you some ideas on how I finished them off. Clear sequins are great. They just have a little bit of like Aurora Borealis finish to them. They'll match anything. And I think when you're doing a batch of cards, if you can kind of get rid of some of the decisions that you need to make when you're going to embellish them, you'll really get a lot more done in less time. And there's plenty of options you can do. You can add ribbon, you can not add ribbon, you can have a knot in the front or a knot in the back. Actually, I just taped the back of that and put my little tag on there, so I didn't have the bulk of the knot. It's, you know, you do have some choices to make. And plus, when you're doing your watercolor panel, you have all kinds of choices to make there. So it's fun. You get enough options to go from, and you get to have a nice batch of cards when you're done. So I hope you found this helpful. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope you give some of these watercolor techniques a try on your next cards. I will link everything I used that I can find in the video description. Like I mentioned, this tag curler, I probably could find one on eBay. These were discontinued quite a long time ago, but I really wanted to use it because I have so many of these little tags left over, and it's nice when you can use up the stuff you already have. So maybe you don't have this, but you have some other tag or tab or embellishment that has been sitting in your drawers collecting dust. See if you can find a way to use those on your cards in a new way so they look fresh and new, and it always feels good to get stuff used up so then you can replace it with other things that you might prefer. Thanks again for watching. I would appreciate a thumbs up before you go. That really helps my channel and my videos reach new people. And thank you so much for watching. Until next time, happy crafting!